Okay, so far we've covered 2 of the 3 sections of this class, 2 of the 3 technologies that we're going to cover. To review, client. Oh, it's a cart, of course. Which is someone running a web browser, connects to the internet, and makes requests to a server, web server, that creates a response. And we identified that a request would be if you type in the address in the URL, or the URL in the address bar, if you click a link, if you press the submit button, and a request consists of the URL, possibly some form data, possibly some, or your IP address, which gets translated into a location, your platform, and some other stuff. So the request is not, or the request does not just consist of the URL. There's other stuff that goes along with it. Static pages are boring. Server simply grabs them and delivers them. What's more interesting from the perspective of this class is dynamic pages, or our dynamic pages, where we have a script, which is a little mini program, a set of instructions that takes a request and all the stuff that comes with it, probably interacts with a database or other resources, and prepares a response. The response, of course, is a web page, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's important to remember. No matter what the mechanism is, whether it be static or dynamic, what the user gets back is a web page, which consists of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So if I was looking at something and trying to decide if it was done via client or server scripting, here would be a couple of tip-offs. One is if it looked like it's something that required a lot of resources, like a Google search. Well, I don't have an index of every single web page on my machine within the browser, but Google's server does. So that's a resource-intensive thing. Placing an order at Amazon. Well, we have to send our information to Amazon's database so that they can update it and ship it to me, right, and bill me. Looking up the price of, or looking up an item on eBay. Well, that requires looking up and the database of all the items along with the bids that were placed on the item and so on. Checking out my Facebook feed. Well, people post and update the Facebook database from all different kinds of computers. That information lives on a database server, but it gets transformed into my Facebook feed. Canvas, logging on. All the user IDs and passwords aren't on my machine, they're on the Canvas server. That's verified, and then I get a page that shows me my courses. So anything that when A complete page is delivered, and B is resource intensive, that's a good sign that is probably server-side scripting. Now, once it gets delivered to the client, because the client is also a computer, we can write, or client-side scripts have been written that allow the user to manipulate the page a little bit, to do small little operations on the database. For example, put your mouse over a menu item and you get a drop-down menu. It's a great example of something that's on client side. You're not getting back a whole new page, you're just changing the page a little bit. Validating. You go and you enter data into a form and click submit. back necessarily a whole new page. You might just get little error messages that pop up on the page. So the page has just been tweaked a little bit. Or if there's no errors, then it will submit it to the web server. So, signs that is done via client-side scripting are A, that is virtually instantaneous. And B, it requires altering an already loaded page. Now, we can find exceptions to this, though. We can find behavior that doesn't fit either of these two categories, or actually, it fits both categories. It has some characteristics of client-side scripting, and it has some characteristics of server-side scripting. Let me give you the classic example. I go to Google, and I start typing in the address bar. So I type in an H. It shows me absolutely nothing. Let's try that again. All right, I pull up Google. And I start typing. So I type in an H. It shows me the top 4 things that people search for that start with H. I type a T. It shows me the top 4 things that start with HT. And so on. Alright? So, if you think about that, that actually has characteristics of both of the things that we've talked about. Number one, this requires some resources, right? Because it's searching Google's database to come up with these things. It's not just making stuff up. Alright? So it's actually searching Google's database. And it doesn't matter what letters we type in. Alright? Doesn't matter, all right? Whatever we type in. So that's a clue that it's probably not happening on my machine. My machine doesn't have the resources to hold Google's complete database of things. So this is coming from the Google server. Yet, I'm not reloading the whole page. I'm just reloading this section of the page. All right? So, in that respect, the fact that I'm not reloading a whole new page, it seems like it's client-side scripting. In the other respect, that this requires a lot of resources, seems to indicate that it is server-side scripting. So which is it? Actually, it's what's known as Ajax. And Ajax is sort of a name. It's not a programming language. Ajax is a name for a particular way of integrating client and server-side scripting. So this looks like both client-side and server-side scripting because it is both client-side and server-side scripting. All right? There's a client-side component, the part that makes the request and gets the data back and redraws the screen. And then there's a server-side component, the part where the Google database is searched and the top 4 results are returned to it. Now, this looked instantaneous, but that's a little bit of trickery, all right? Because the server is not returning an entire web page back, it can act a little quicker. It's just sending back a little pieces of data. And because the client side is doing the updating on the page, that can happen very quickly as well. There's other examples of this. If you have a Gmail account, if you sit there and watch your screen, if someone sends you a Gmail, it just appears on your page. All right, you don't have to hit refresh or anything, or bring it up again. You know, you can sit there and boom, you get notified. Facebook notifications are like that too, right? If you posted something and someone responds to it, boom, you see a little number go up indicating that you have a response or whatever. So both of those things are examples of behaviors of both client-side and server-side scripting. It looks like client-side because not the whole page is refreshed, and it looks like server-side because it seems to require a lot of resources. These are examples of Ajax. And all Ajax is a different way of making a request and a different way of sending a response. This kind of request is an HTTP request. Ajax requests are XML HTTP requests. And generally speaking, it's only going to include, well, I won't say that. It's going to include a URL and other stuff as well. But it's not accomplished by clicking on a submit button or clicking on a link or typing in an address bar. This actually gets generated via JavaScript. Now, in the case of a response, it's very similar to what a web server normally does. In other words, you'll call a script on the web server side. The web server will interact with the database or do whatever it needs to do. The difference is it's not sending back a full page, as what happens with HTTP requests. In the case of an XML HTTP request, it's going to send back just a chunk of data. Now, there's options for the format of the data, and we'll talk about that later, but it's not sending back a whole page. It's just sending back some data. So, for example, when we did that Google thing, and we typed into the search bar a couple letters, and it showed us the top 4 things. That's all the server's sending back is those 4 items. All right? Maybe it's a comma delimited data. I don't know. You'd have to look at the internals of it to figure that out. But it's not sending back a whole web page. And that makes the transaction happen a little bit quicker than sending back a whole web page. JavaScript then takes that chunk of data and does what it does best, or one of the things it does best, and that is altering an already loaded page. So, I go to follow through the logic all the way through. I go to Google and press an H in the search bar. That sends a request to the Google server to say, give me the top 4 items that start with an H. Google thinks about it for a second, sends me back those 4 items. My web page grabs those 4 items and displays them in a little box. I type in the next letter. A second letter, or both letters are sent to the server. The server returns back the top 4 items that start with HT. My JavaScript takes those 4 items and rewrites the box, now with the stuff that starts with HT, and so on and so forth. So that whole thing is called Ajax, that whole interchange. So it's not a new programming language, and it's not a new scripting. It's simply a certain way of using JavaScript and server-side scripting together. All right, so for this class, I think it's important to have an overview of where we're going before we do it. In this class, we're going to cover things in this sequence. You can almost guess that we're going to do Ajax last, right? Because to do Ajax, you have to know JavaScript and server-side scripting. So, of course, we're going to do that one last, because that brings together those 2 technologies. We're going to start out by talking about client-side server-side scripting, which is JavaScript. All right. We're then going to go to server-side scripting, which in this class is going to be PHP. All right. There's any number of different server-side scripting options, and the one we're going to do is PHP. Why? Well, because it's important that you don't do everything in Microsoft Technologies in our programs. All right. So we're using PHP, which is an open source technology. And then finally, we'll close out the class by talking about Ajax. Any questions about the overview? All right, let's get to the fun part. And some of this was covered in CISS232, but depending on the semester and how far behind we were or whatever, you know, sometimes I talk a little bit about JavaScript, sometimes I talk a little bit more about JavaScript. So we're going to start out reviewing it at any rate. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to get a simple system of drop-down menus going. All right, that'll be our first task. All right. Now, do keep in mind that when I do examples like this, I aim to not make a complete web page, but just make an example that just shows the stuff that's relevant. Now, your second homework assignment involves doing a style sheet switcher, I think. All right. We will probably talk about that at the end of class today or on Monday. All right. But first I want to give an overview of JavaScript. And JavaScript fits in our little triangle of client-side technologies. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They all relate to each other. HTML, if you remember, is the content and the logical structure of a page. By content, I mean the text, the links, the images, and so forth. By logical structure, I mean we have a section of the page that's a heading. We have a section of the page that is the navigation, a section that's the footer, and so on down the line. CSS is responsible for the appearance. So what about that text? Is it black on a white background? Is it blue on a yellow background? That's the appearance of it. It has nothing to do with the content, right? We could put the Gettysburg Address up there and have all different color font and background combinations. Same content, different appearance. And also the physical layout. The physical layout is connected to the logical structure, right? The logical structure says I have a section of the page that's a navigation, right? Here's my nav section. The physical layout says, okay, well that nav section appears going along the top of the page, or it goes going down on the right side of the page, or left side of the page, or right side of the page, or bottom, or whatever. So this divides the page into sections. This says how the sections are physically laid out on the page. JavaScript is behavior activity. And generally, there's exceptions, all right? But for the most part, the recipe for JavaScript is the user does something. JavaScript knows that the user did something and responds by changing something about the page. What about the pages is going to change? It's going to change either the JavaScript or the HTML or the CSS of the page. It's able to change anything that you set up in your web page. JavaScript can access and change. Can change all the properties of the page. So let's start out by doing menus. All right, let's start out by doing a very simple menu example. So I'm going to go in here and bring up Notepad. right, we'll treat you this semester and we'll use Notepad++. Cutting edge. All right, I'm going to go and make the font bigger. And I'm going to go and just put a shell of a web page. And I'm going to first create the HTML that will do it the way I want. Then I'm going to create the CSS. And then we'll do the JavaScript to make it interactive. And we could do this a few different ways. I'm just going to pick one. All right, so I'm going to put my doc type, HTML. HTML. Head. And within the head, I'm going to put a title. And I'm going to put a body. And then finally, I'm going to put an end HTML. Now again, this class is not an HTML class, but this is a good opportunity for you to practice your HTML. So follow good standards as you're developing your pages and so on. I'm going to be using the Html5 tags. All right, so I'm going to have a header section. And then I'm going to put my menus in a navigation section. We're going to start off simple with just like one level of menu. Because I don't actually have all the pages, I'm just going to make every URL have a href of £. Again, you need an href to make a link. And again, normally this will be the actual page, right? But since I'm not going to go and make a dozen pages for this example, I'm just going to use £. So in your case, you'll put in the actual URL for the page that you're linked to. So let's say this is menu item 1. All right. And I lied. I'm going to do a couple menu items. Here's menu item 2. All right. For each of these menu items, there's going to be a submenu. So I'm going to make a submenu 1 that has 2 menu items, and a submenu 2 that has 2 menu items. All I'm doing right now is I'm doing the HTML. And what am I doing in the HTML? I'm doing the HTML's job. I'm putting the content. In other words, this is what I want to be on the page. I want to have a menu, and then I want to have For each menu item, I want to have a submenu. I'm going to save this. And I can view it in the browser. And there we go. There's my menus with submenus. Now, obviously, that's not what we want, ultimately. We want to have something like this, where we have a main menu going across the top. And as we put our mouse on a menu item, we get the submenu to appear. But yet, this is the HTML that we want. All right? What do we need to change then? Not the HTML, but the appearance. All right? So what is that a job for? If we want to change the appearance of something, what is that the job for? CSS. So what we want to do is we want to make these submenus invisible. All right? How do we do that? How can I make these submenus invisible?
What if we put them in a div and then just make those divs visibility false?
We could. Couple things though. First of all, why would we need to put it in a div? Okay. Okay. You could actually do that, but you don't need a div to do that. You could just make the unordered lists invisible. All right. So how do we make the unordered lists invisible? Well, if I did this, this isn't the right answer. Right, because that's going to make all of them invisible.
Couldn't you just give them a class or the other two, the four that you want to make invisible, a class or an ID?
Exactly. All right. So we don't want to make all ULs invisible because menu's gone. All right. So we could give them a class or an ID. Which should we do?
The ones for submenu 1 give the UL an ID of submenu 1, and then the ones for submenu 2 give them an ID for submenu 2, because you're going to want to, when you want to put them under the original thing so they drop down, you're going to want them under different ID for class, right?
Okay. If I can paraphrase what you're saying, and it's correct, all right, we want to give them IDs because we want to treat them separately. We're not treating them as a group, all right? Initially, that's true that they're both going to be invisible, but we want to show one when we put our mouse over the one thing. We want to show the other when we put our mouse over the other thing. So we want to treat them individually. All right, we don't always want to show both submenus. We want to show one of the submenus or the other. So I'll go along with that. There are multiple correct answers for this, by the way. You could give a class of submenu and then make the submenus invisible. All right. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to give each of these two an ID. So I'm going to say ID. submenu 1, ID submenu 2. Remember, an ID has to be unique. That's going to become even more important as we're doing JavaScript. And I can give both of them the same by saying this. Alright, so now if we go and view the page, we see the main menu, but not the submenu. Alright, moving in the right direction. Alright, so how do we make the submenu appear when we put our mouse over it? Think about what we're asking to do. We're asking to change the CSS. Which of our technologies is responsible for changing the CSS or HTML of a page? JavaScript, right? We want a user action to set the ball rolling, and then we want to respond to by changing either the CSS or HTML. That's a classic recipe for JavaScript. User action, the user does something. And again, to be sure, there's exceptions, but user does something. Puts their mouse over a link. The page responds by having a snippet of JavaScript that changes something about the page. In this case, it makes a portion of the page visible. It makes one of the divs visible. Alright, so I can actually put here on the LI, on mouse over, what does that mean? Alright? Yeah. That means that when the user places their mouse on this HTML element, something's going to happen. Alright? Remember, what gets the ball rolling? Some user action. The user actions are called events. An event is when the user does something. And there's a whole bunch of events. And they typically start with the word on. We can see a list of them here. On drag, on double click, on change, on drag enter, on drag leave, on error, on focus, on key down, on key press, and so on and so forth. Well, the one in particular that we're interested in is when the user puts their mouse on that item. Alright? So, when the user does that, we want to do something. What do we want to do? I want to point to the thing and change its visibility. Alright. What do I want to point to? I want to point to this UL. How do I identify the thing that I want to point to? In other words, I have 3 ULs up here. How do I say which UL I want to change? You use the ID. That's another reason for defining an ID, like you suggested. We're going to use IDs to point to the thing that we want to change. You know, now I wouldn't do this, but let's say I wanted to call one of you students up, and I could say, student number 125678, you need to talk to me after class. Alright? Only one of you would come after class, right? Unless you didn't know your own ID or whatever. Alright? Only one of you would come because an ID uniquely identifies you and just you. So when we make changes to this, when we want to point to something to change it, we're going to use the ID. Because the ID, or most of the time, we're going to use the ID. Because the ID points to the one specific thing that it has. So how do we point to an ID? We point to an ID using a built-in JavaScript function called document dot get element by ID, and then we put in the ID that we want. In this case, it's submenu 1. So this part of our JavaScript statement, and again, events are HTML attributes, and their value are going to be some JavaScript statement. So document, get element by ID, submenu 1. That points to the thing on the page that has an ID of submenu 1. This instruction here is going to be one of our workhorses in JavaScript, because this allows us to point to the specific thing on the page that we want to do something with. Alright? This is what's known as a DOM expression. D-O-M. D-O-M stands for Document Object Model. It's simply a way of referring to different things of the page, the different components or the different objects on the page. Document means the thing that we're interested in is on our current web page. Alright? And you might think, well, isn't everything we're interested in on our current page? No, you can do other stuff as well. You could open a pop-up window and manipulate that. Alright? But document says, hey, the thing that we're interested in is on the current page. Get element by ID is a function. A function where we give an ID and it returns the object that matches that ID. If there's no object that matches that ID, we get an error. Alright? JavaScript is case sensitive. So if I don't spell this correctly, if I put a capital D in document or a capital D in ID, it doesn't know what that means. Alright, so I'm now pointing to that thing on the page. What do I want to do with it? I want to change its style. What do I want to change about its style? I want to change its visibility. What do I want to change the visibility to? To visible. So, we make the font a little bit smaller so we can see the whole instruction. On mouse over equals document get element by ID submenu 1 style visibility equals visible. Notice that within the quotes, within the double quotes go around the entire JavaScript statement. I can't use double quotes within there, otherwise it would think that that was the end of the JavaScript statement. So I have to use single quotes wherever quotes would otherwise be needed. This part points to the submenu that I want to change. This part says, what do I want to change about it? I want to change the style. What about the style? I want to change the visibility. And what about that? I want to make it visible. Let's make sure that this works. There we go. Now, when we move our mouse out, it doesn't make it disappear. Why? Well, because we didn't write any code to make it disappear. Alright? So, we can do that in almost the same way. If there's an on mouse over, there can also be an on mouse out. We can change the visibility back to hidden. So I put my mouse disappears, take my mouse off, and nothing happens. Did I click refresh? Ooh, I have a problem. Well, this is perfect because, well, I see the problem already. I changed it. I just copied that and I didn't change it to on mouse out. Alright, there, now it's working. Now, number 2 should be pretty easy to do, right? It's going to be exactly the same, except I'm going to do that thing with menu 2. So, I made some good strides here on getting this to work. But there's still a few things that are not right about this. Namely, I put my mouse over menu item 1, I actually go to click one of those items and boom, it disappears. So how are we going to have to make this work?
You're going to have to move the menu item 1 and menu item 2 so they're next to each other, and then submenus pop up underneath so when you mouse over them, and then make it so when you mouse over them they don't vanish.
Right. In a nutshell, what we're going to have to do is something like this. Let's draw it. We're going to have to make it so that and we could do this any number of different ways. I'll sketch a couple of them. We could make it where the main menu is like this. So, and then we'll have to make it so that when the mouse is over this area, we have the same code in that we have in our main menu. That is, on mouse over, show, on mouse out, hide. So we're going to have to put that code in there, and we're going to have to make sure there's no gaps between the two. Because if there's even a slightest gap between the two, when we take our mouse out and move it from here into sort of the gap area, it's going to disappear before we can put our mouse over there and show it again, keep it showing. So we're going to want these right up against each other so that if I move my mouse from here to here, I've set it to visible before I have a chance to hide it, before it disappears. So we're going to have to make sure that there's no gap at all between those two. So, in other words, first thing we have to do is this. I'm going to go and I'm going to put the same code that I have here on my ULs. So that when the mouse is over those guys, they continue to show and they don't disappear. But that's still not enough, because as I move my mouse out of there, it disappears before we have a chance to make it visible. So, what do we need to change about this to make it work? Do we need to change the HTML at all? No. We have our content. We have our menus and submenus. Don't need to change those at all. Do we need to change the JavaScript? No. JavaScript does its job. You put your mouse over it, it appears. Take your mouse away, it disappears. We've done that both for the main menus and the submenus. Well, that doesn't leave many options of what we need to change. And do we need to change the CSS? Absolutely, right? Why? Well, because we need these things to be positioned so that there's no gap between them. And things that deal with the physical positioning of items on the page, that's an aspect of CSS. So, I try to do an example like this to show you how the pieces fit together. The HTML has the content. It has all the content in it. By using CSS, by using CSS, we hide the content that we don't want to see initially. We write JavaScript to show and hide the content as needed, and then we also use CSS to accomplish the proper positioning of the items so that it works in a way that we want. So, a good exercise for you, and this is not a lab assignment, but it's something that it would be a great exercise to do, would be before Monday, going and, I'll post this example to Canvas, taking it and changing it to make the CSS work for this. Make the CSS so that there's no gaps between the things. And we'll go over how to do that on Monday, but it would be great if you at least gave it a shot, even if you can't figure it out completely. All right, now, about your Stylesheet Switcher assignment. If you Google CSS Stylesheet Switcher, actually, yeah, you can Google that. Here's one example, and there's a whole bunch of other examples as well. All right? What you need to do is you need to create two style sheets. Use this particular script, which you can download. And then you need to do this to have an on-click event. You have to create a link so that the user can initiate the style sheet change, but that link will have an on-click event to it so that when you click on it, it calls a function. Now, we haven't talked about functions yet, but I'm sure many of you have done programming in other languages where you take a set of instructions and you give them a name, and that's called a function. The script that you can download here contains a function, set active style sheet. And what it does is it takes an argument and makes that the style sheet for your page. You don't have to understand how this works completely, all right, for it to work, all right? This is more an exercise about figuring out how you can call a piece of JavaScript, all right? The part that you do need to do and understand is this part, where you actually create the links and you call that function and give it the name of the style sheets. So really this seems like an intimidating task, but really it's about using code that someone else wrote. All right? And my hope is by doing this, you can kind of see how stuff fits together between the CSS, the HTML, and the JavaScript. All right, so I'm not sure when I made assignments due. I think I made them due Wednesday. Yeah. So we can take a look at this in lab next week if you're having questions or struggling with it. I think your first lab is due this week. That's a fairly straightforward one. I will post this example, the one with the menus, up to Canvas, and take a look at it and try to complete it. And we'll look at completing it on Monday. All right, that's all I had. We'll see you in lab. Any questions?